This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Hope everybody is enjoying St. Patrick's Day if you're trying to bring a little bit of luck of the Irish into your life. First time we've ever gotten a request for a weekend perspective. I guess first time I've had sort of a direct request for a bunch of topics within a weekend perspective. Had lots of people say, hey, have you ever thought about covering this or covering that? And we've done that a number of times. People will send in topics the same way they'll request topics for the interview show. But had a request for some kind of diving into corporate communications and, how your company goes about your company or any company that you're kind of trying to analyze or sort of understand. How do they go about doing internal communication at sort of a high level, not like, hey, we use Slack or we use email or something, just to communicate within the teams, but like, how does your executive team communicate internally? So big announcements or town halls or quarterly updates or whatever those things might be. Could be people getting promoted, could be a layoff, could be whatever that thing could be. How do you go about doing it externally, right? What's the mechanism do you think your company uses to communicate things externally? So maybe you've made a change to how you're going to go do business, or you acquired a company, or whatever that thing might be. And then just sort of some asks of how should you interpret this stuff? So if you're a manager and you've got a team, and the quarterly meeting comes along, what sort of things should you do as a manager? How should you interpret that? How should you pass those things along to your team? How do you deal with the questions that come out of it? All that sort of stuff. So I thought it would be a good discussion topic, set of discussion topics, because I think most people who are listening to the show at some point are on one side of that equation or another. And there are companies who do it well. There are situations in which companies may not necessarily do it well, and they may still be a very good communicator, but they get something wrong. So I thought we'd dig into that a little bit today. I thought it was a good topic to sort of go after. So why don't we begin with sort of internal types of things, internal communication, looking at, so let's take a normal thing that the company's going to tell. And it's important to sort of understand from an internal communication perspective that while you may think of your company and you go, oh, well, we know certain people, we know, kind of how things work within the company. There is as much kind of scrutiny, if you will, as much effort that goes into internal stuff, maybe sometimes more than even external stuff. And the reason I say that is because, there is in most teams, in most companies, somewhere in either the executives team or in communications or, marketing, typically somewhere within there, or even, within like an engineering organization or a product or a sales organization, they're going to typically have some sort of communication team or set of people whose job it is to kind of drive the communication itself, right? So they're going to be writing things out. They're going to be looking for approvals from people. They're going to be, dealing with all the iterations. Do we want it to be worded this way? Do we want it to be worded that way? And so the first thing to understand is there is typically a process that goes on, even though if you're reading them, it may sometimes feel like it's sort of scatterbrained. And again, a lot of times the thing to kind of remember about these things is how long did the team that put it out, how long did they likely have to kind of put this together, right? And the thing to remember is there are so many times in business where, you think, oh, well, they must be thinking about this stuff. What do those people do all day long, right? If they're not thinking about the big picture things, what are they doing? They're like everybody else, your CEO, your senior vice president, they're like anybody else. They've got, 12 things going on all the time. They're in a bunch of meetings. They've got their own work to get done. So let's say something comes along. So whatever it might be, Could be your quarterly numbers, right? So you're going to announce internally to the organization, this is how we did for the quarter in terms of revenues or in terms of goals or in terms of maybe you're going to put some forward-looking things in there about, based on whether we did well or didn't do well, what are we going to do next? Maybe there's going to be some reorganization of teams. Maybe a new leader is going to step in or a leader is going to leave. All those things happen all the time. And the trick to it is usually the amount of time that comes into coordinating these things is usually very, very short. And so there is a lot of iteration. There is a lot of, what do we want to write? What do we want to communicate to people? And I think the first thing that kind of gets lost sometimes in these things is, and this is where people typically get frustrated, is as a reader, you tend to read it as, from your perspective. So you're sitting there reading something and you're going, well, what does it mean for me? What am I getting out of this? What is us making the quarterly numbers mean? What does a new vice president of the group mean for me? And I think what happens from a corporate communication perspective is you tend to write it, if you were the writer, you tend to write it from a, what does it mean from the perspective of, let's say, the CEO or, some high level company goals. And those two things might be very different, or at least they might be disconnected enough in a way, or I don't want to say disconnected, but like not connected enough to where you can create a lot of confusion. And that's usually the first sort of confusion that happens is that it's written at a higher level. It's focused on company goals. It's focused on, kind of company revenues or company future or company org chart or whatever it might be. And for a lot of the individuals or even for the managers, the first thing they're looking for is like, what's in it for me? Or are we mentioned? Are we included in this? And they're trying to figure out like, should I care about this? Right. And so that's always the first sort of disconnect. And that's a really hard thing to deal with, especially if you're in a larger organization or even a mid-sized organization is, does like the internal communication connect with people at all? Does it, who is it trying to connect to? Or is it really just sort of satisfying the thing that kind of corporate or the executive staff or whatever has to do in order to be able to, maybe pass it on to their board or pass it out to the public markets and stuff like that. So that's always the first thing is, it is very hard to connect the audiences from the sender to the receiver in corporate corporate communications, right? The second piece of it is typically you are sending something that you want to be communicated. So again, maybe a leader left the team, right? Or somebody new is coming into the team, but oftentimes you're communicating something that maybe a little challenging. So why did Bill Smith decide to leave the company, right? Aren't we a great company? And so this is where you sort of get into some things that people often say are platitudes or just sort of buzzwords, or you're kind of sugarcoating things. And in some cases, the reality of it is let's say Bill Smith left the company and you have no idea why Bill left, right? Bill might have been an underperforming person who, people were like, hey, we don't really trust that guy anymore. And so maybe he was asked to move out of the company. Maybe Bill got an opportunity that just wasn't going to happen within your company, right? And this is one of those scenarios in which oftentimes people go, well, if Bill was so great, why didn't they find something for him? And, it may just be that the people that work above Bill or in parallel to Bill, while he may be really good, they're all equally as good. And when you get into sort of the hierarchy of companies, as with anything, it's not like there's 15 CEO jobs. There's not 27, senior vice presidents of product job, right? The hierarchy and the pyramid that sort of, as you move up the chain, there are less of those jobs. And so there are times when people leave because they just go, well, I'm not going to be able to achieve that in the time frame that I want. It doesn't align with what the company wants. And so I'm going to look externally. And if you're a company in an internal communication, like you don't have the window to explain all that stuff, right? Like there's personal drama in there. There's stuff that you don't necessarily want to communicate. There's all sorts of stuff in there. And so oftentimes, when people say, hey, they're watered down or they're platitudes, it's because there's just not the space to do that. So there's not a better way to go about doing that. You just sort of have to say, well, we wish him the best. And, he's looking for other opportunities, and we really appreciate all the great things that they did for us. So there are going to be scenarios like that in which, because we have so much drama on television or in the media or in social media, right? Like we always think like there's so much more going on there. And in some cases, it's just not. It's just the nature of somebody wanted something else, or the timing of what the company could do for somebody just didn't necessarily align to what their goals or ambitions were. So you have to sort of take some of that with a grain of salt, right? Now, is there a way that you can change this, change some of these things in terms of like whose perspective you could give versus other perspectives? And this is where you get into other forms of communication, right? So if you're simply writing a one form of communication, so you're writing an email, for example, or you're putting out a video, but there's no way to respond back to it. That's sort of a one-way form of communication. One way you could deal with this is to publish it to some sort of forum, to some sort of communication medium that has multiple channels. And again, this is where you kind of get into, is this something that, from a communication perspective, you really want to have discussion around? Even though people might want to have discussion, but do you really want to have discussion around? Is it really going to benefit anybody for this? Or, do you just sort of go, well, no, this is just something that we just need to put out, right? It's really just kind of a statement of whatever. It's a statement of fact, or it's a statement of change, or it's a statement of direction. At this time, a forum for discussion may or may not make the most sense. And again, it depends on the situation, but those are kind of all the things that go into just basic corporate communication. You want to make sure that the groups that are directly impacted, or the groups that need to be called out, are specifically called out and called out the right way. You want to make sure you try and get as much of the facts of what you're trying to communicate into this thing. And then you're kind of trying to determine what do you expect the next steps to be? Do you need to write an FAQ, right? Was that written? Do you need to have a time in which people can do a live Q&A? Do you need to make sure that you're tracking whether or not the information gets leaked out into the public, right? So there's all those sort of things you have to keep in mind. The next part of the question, the request that came in, was, what's the best form of doing internal communications? And this is, again, one of those questions that, it's a great question, but it's written as if there is a single answer, right? What's the best way to deliver this, right? Should it be an email? Should it be a video? Should it be a live all hands? I think it all completely depends. It depends on a number of things. Number one is, what is the thing we're communicating, right? Is it just sort of statements of fact that people need to read? It is what it is. Is it something in which we know that it's a change, right? So if you're doing sort of statements of fact, you can probably do those as sort of one-way communication. If it's a big change that impacts a lot of people, that's probably something that you're going to want to have, maybe not just like a single mechanism in which there's more open discussion, but maybe a series of things, right? So maybe you're reorganizing the company, right? You're going to make a bunch of changes. Those are things that impact multiple levels of the company. A lot of people are going to be concerned. They're going to have questions. There's going to be like, okay, why did we do this? What are we doing? What are the next steps? What are the new expectations? And again, this is where you get into lots of people being like, how does this impact me? How does this impact my team? So those types of things, you're going to want to have other forms of communication, whether they are roundtables, whether they are, you have to determine like, can we do this face to face? Can we do this via electronic means? Are people getting their questions answered? You may also want to think about, the sort of purely top-down way of doing internal communications is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is sort of think of it as like creating a proxy or a sort of a hierarchical way of doing it. So maybe you're going to communicate something to the whole company, but behind the scenes, you say, look, we know there are going to be a ton of questions about this. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty about this. We need to do some stuff ahead of time in which we basically do kind of like a training or a preparation for certain hierarchies within the company. So maybe it's at the division level, right? You're going to go, okay, this is going to impact your group this way, and this way. These are the changes that are going to happen. This is how it fits into the new company goals. And then that division leader might go, well, I've got 5 different groups within whatever we do. I need to sort of prep this. And so what you can then sort of think about doing is going, we can customize this, personalize this down at a lower level so that you're not getting a situation in which you have a kind of an open forum and you've got an individual who's saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, why, how is this going to impact my job? And put the CEO in a situation in which they go, I don't know the specific answer to your question because I don't know specifically what your job does, right? You want to be able to try and answer the questions as close to the question as possible with as much knowledge of why is that question being asked? Who is the person? And so oftentimes, the best thing to do again is that sort of hierarchical thing of, how do we pass this along? Now, where that can be a little bit complicated is if the thing that's being announced internally is fairly, I don't want to say fairly important, but fairly secretive, right? So like large organizational changes oftentimes aren't really going to be discussed with a really broad number of people behind the scenes before it happens, right? So, maybe we're going to make a big change. Maybe there's going to be some sort of layoff or something that you can't necessarily share with the whole company ahead of time because it'll get chaotic. You won't actually get to making a decision. And so, there's a sort of a small group of people that know the information, know it's going to happen. The announcement gets made, and then you've got to kind of deal with all the questions and so forth. That's the kind of stuff that in the same vein, you need to have a plan for how you're going to roll out communication and education, but it probably has to be as soon after the announcement as possible, right? So there are situations for both of those. Communication teams typically do this, but again, it depends on how big the organization is, how far you want the sort of scope of internal knowledge, first knowledge to be, and then the sort of secondary knowledge and so forth. I think the other piece of it really depends on the question was like, well, what's the best mechanism to do this? Should it be email? Should it be video? Should it be some other thing? I think you have to also be conscious of whoever is presenting the information, whoever the speaker is, the announcer of the information, kind of what's their best medium for communication, right? And I say this, and a lot of times people will say, well, they should jump on video, right? Because then people can see them or whatever. There are plenty of people who have sort of their strengths in how they communicate. Some people are fantastic face to face. Others are more introverted. And, if you were to put them on a video, even though video distribution can get out to thousands and thousands of people, if it looks like they're just reading off of a teleprompter and their personality isn't one that's going to convey enthusiasm or empathy or whatever it might be, that might not be the right medium for them to do that. So I think that's the other thing you need to keep in mind is like the answer to sort of what's the best thing is kind of having an understanding of both what's going to come across the best, not that you're sugarcoating it, but like if you're trying to convey confidence, you want to do it in a way that aligns best with the person who's trying to do that. And again, there's all sorts of nuances to doing that, but there isn't a right answer to that. I think you can experiment with some stuff, but you have to be conscious of like how does your internal teams consume information? What's a good medium for the speaker to go about doing that puts them in a good light? Because again, you're trying to convey confidence, or you're trying to convey empathy, or you're trying to convey boldness of strategy, whatever it might be. You want to keep all those sort of things in mind. Okay. So that's a lot of internal stuff, or at least scratches the surface on some internal stuff, some stuff to keep in mind. Now, let's flip it over. So you need to communicate something externally. To a certain extent, like external communication is its own art form. It follows a lot of the things from internal communications, but it is sort of its own art form because when you're putting stuff out in the public domain, you have to remember that you have very little control beyond hitting send what the message is going to be. And then you also have to realize that unlike when you internally communicate and you probably have people that are on your side, that want you to succeed, that want you to be successful because they're part of the company, they want to be successful, all those sort of things. When you put stuff out into the public domain, not only do people not necessarily want you to succeed, right? It depends on your brand and it depends what you do and all that sort of stuff. But you've got a lot of different, entities that are consuming the information that literally have business plans based on that information. So, for example, if your company announces a new product or your company announces, something positive or something negative, there's a bunch of people that care about that information. So first and foremost, if you are a public company, so you're a public company, you have public stock, Wall Street cares about that. And they're going to essentially grade your announcement based on what the stock price is going to be. So you have to be very conscious of, okay, how much information do they need? How do we sort of position this such that hopefully it can be in the best possible light? But there are people downstream of what you do that are going to value that, right? And they're going to value it through market means, right? The cost or value of your company. There are going to be competitors who look at what you put out there and they're going to go, okay, there's now a new piece of information in the marketplace. There's now a new action that's happened in the game that we're playing. How do we go about responding to that? And so again, you have to think about your communications in terms of, how are my competitors going to respond to this? You are going to have customers who are going to see this stuff and they're going to go, okay, does this change the relationship that we have with that company? Do we trust them more? Do we not trust them as much? Do we have a new reason to want to engage with them? Are they now selling something that we're really interested in? Obviously, those people have a different view than, say, Wall Street does, or your competitors do, right? So again, different view of people, but you still only really put one piece of information out into the world. And then you could have all sorts of other folks nowadays with social media, right? You could, people that want to pick on companies, want to be activists, want to, whatever those things might be, and they're going to take and do what they want with your message, right? So the external communication is much more difficult because, again, you're putting it out there in the public domain and you can do a whole bunch of things to sort of support it. But the first initial thing out there, you're trying to figure out a way of knowing that there's all these constituents out there, there's all these groups out there with different, motivations based on the information. You're trying to satisfy as many of those as you possibly can, right? And you're trying to put yourself in the best light as possible, whether the news you're putting out is positive or negative, right? So for example, if you happen to be like laying off 1,000 people, yes, that's an action. Yes, that feels like, okay, that's a negative thing. The company isn't doing as well, whatever it might be. You're also looking for ways to spin that in which you're going, well, the reason we're doing this is because it's going to position us in a better way going forward. We have more resources aligned on the higher priorities, or we're exiting a market that we thought we were going to get into, but we're not getting into, hence we're not going to lose as much money in that space, whatever it might be, right? You're looking for ways to balance those things. So external communication is a little bit different. Typically what happens with external communications is you are going to have groups, especially the bigger your company is, you're going to have groups that deal with all of those sort of external entities, right? So you're going to have a group that knows how to communicate and will probably have more information for the Wall Street sort of financial community. You're going to have people that are going to communicate to like analysts, like the Forresters and Gartners and IDCs and Silicon Angles of the world, right? You're going to have people who, you're going to give your sales force or your channel partners, your technology partners ways to communicate to your customers so that they understand it in more depth. They're not just kind of getting headlines and so forth. So typically you have a bunch of constituents that you're going to have more information for. And again, there are going to be situations in which you have to announce stuff that will seem very much in line. Hey, here's our quarterly numbers. Hey, we have new product announcements, those sort of things. Other times you're going to make significant changes that are probably going to surprise some people. So when the person wrote in the comment, they said, hey, Southwest Airlines recently decided to make a huge change from something they've done for 25 years to, they no longer allow you to check your bag for free, which was sort of part of the whole ethos of that company, the brand of that company. And, that was sort of shocking, surprised people. I don't know that there's necessarily a best way to go about doing that, because what's going to end up happening is no matter how much you communicate why you're doing something like that, when you make a significant change. So, Coca-Cola changing the formula of their flagship product from old Coke to new Coke, or, your sports team who trades away your favorite player, the fan's favorite player, something along those lines. Like, those are things that sometimes you just have to, you made a reason for the decision. People aren't going to all understand it. No matter what communication you put out, they're only going to read the headline. They're going to internalize it, let it emotionally sort of hit them. And then, that's where you sort of have to go, okay, now we have to have a second wave of communication. Why did we go about doing this? How is this going to impact our customers and our partners and so forth? And you have to sort of be ready, almost as ready for the second wave of things that come through than the first wave, right? So there is a rhyme and a reason to some of those things. Again, some of them are going to feel like they were horrible decisions. And sometimes they are. Sometimes businesses just make bad decisions. They think they're making a good decision. This is where sometimes you will see news, you will see like rumors and things get leaked. You'll hear, rumor and speculation is saying that Southwest Airlines is thinking about, getting rid of their bag, no bags fly for free. Oftentimes that is the company themselves kind of floating this out there going, hey, we're thinking about doing this. We think this is the right decision. We think we have the data that tells us what to do. We think we've kind of behind the scenes communicated some stuff, but let's strategically sort of leak this out there as rumors. And, and they know how to use communication channels and other types of things just to see what the blowback is going to be from the marketplace, or the excitement is going to be from the marketplace. In this case, they didn't seem to have done that. People seem to have lots of opinions about it. So there are right and wrong ways of doing it. The times when it goes out wrong, it seems like, how in the world could they ever have done that? I guarantee you, at least for larger organizations, not just some individual, there typically was a lot of thought process that went into it. But yeah, there are times when people just make bad decisions, and we could do a whole show about how bad decisions happen, and how certain leadership decisions happen and so forth. But those things do sort of happen. Okay, we are kind of farther along. Let me get to at least one more thing, and this has to do with sort of like executive town halls, right? So we talked about internal communications. How do we make them better, right? So I think most companies of decent size are going to have a Q&A with the CEO or with the leadership team or whatever. How do we go about making those things better? Because right now they oftentimes feel like it's a burden on the executive who is doing the thing. They don't necessarily feel excited to be there. The questions that come in, or the questions, even though they're supposed to be open Q&A, oftentimes don't feel like they're necessarily filtered to. And what I mean by filtered is, the executive will say, hey, we want to hear from the people. We want to hear what's going on. We want to hear your excitement. We want to hear your negativity and all that sort of stuff. But you've created an open forum, and you got to remember the thing that the executive is hoping to do is they're hoping to hear from the people in the company, because they're closer to the problems, they're closer to the opportunities, they're closer to customers and all that sort of stuff. And they're hoping, well, I'm going to hear from them things that I'm not hearing myself, right? So sort of like more intelligence closer to the problem. And oftentimes what happens is, Bill or Mary or whoever stands up and says, hey, I have a problem with my health insurance, or hey, my manager won't promote me. And this is the trade-off of sort of town halls, is you're hoping they'll go, did you know that we are mistreating our customers, and we're not providing the best service we possibly could? And if we would just make these 3 or 4 small tweaks, or if we would, whatever the thing would be, we could improve the company. And this is a great example of like the disconnect between the scope of what one individual does in their job versus the scope that, say, like a senior leader has, right? So if you're the senior leader, you're like, I'm responsible for the whole company. I kind of have to have some sense of like what the whole company does. The things that I think about every day are hopefully to improve the broader whole company. And if you allow the individuals to sort of ask questions, they're typically going to go, I'm going to think about myself first. Not that any individual is too selfish, but people tend to think about themselves first. They don't necessarily say, oh, I should think about the whole company, because in their mind, they're like, well, that's not my role. That's your role. But I want to tell you about a problem I have. And this is where I kind of say that, like, typically town halls aren't filtered very well, because you would hope that somebody asking a question would be at least a question that a broad number of people in the company could benefit from the answer. And far too often, the answers, the questions are asked at such a small scope that you're sort of like, that's a very valid question, but that's not that's a question that you could ask your manager, because the scope of that question is really contained within your relationship with your manager or within your team or something along those lines. So I don't know that there's a way to fix town halls unless you basically sort of say, hey, please submit your questions ahead of time, and then we will kind of try and filter through them. Again, not to sort of take away, I don't want someone to ask a question of the senior leader who's, that's a tough question. You're really kind of hoping you're going to get questions that are, scalable to the people. And again, this is a hard thing, because you may also want the question that is, hey, I have this tough situation. How can you help me? Right? Because sometimes you do want to personalize things. You do want people to realize that, like, the leadership team cares about certain individuals. I don't want to say certain, all individuals, but you want to present the question in a way that is an individual level thing, which you don't necessarily want to present it in a way of like, hey, I'm struggling to, like, get the insurance company to do my thing. What can you do about it? Where you go, well, we have a mechanism for that, right? Like, so anyways, I think town halls, I think there's ways to do them better. I think, again, it's a filtering exercise, not in terms of you don't want to hear the questions, but like, are you getting the best you can get out of the questions while still letting people feel like they're the ones asking the questions? And then you have that sort of human interaction. So, not a perfect answer for a lot of these things. Anyways, thank you for the question. Thank you for the person who submitted it. Hopefully that was somewhat useful. I think the reality is you're never going to feel like it's as good as it can be, even though your company probably has a team of people that are trying their hardest to kind of make these things work. There are multiple parties involved. A lot of the disconnect that people feel like is they're hoping the thing speaks to them individually, and the people that are building it oftentimes are really speaking from from sort of the company's perspective, the larger organization's perspective. And I think that's the biggest disconnect. And I think if you're giving people any sort of advice, is like, think about, just like you do with any sort of communication, how do you try and frame it such that you're speaking to somebody, as opposed to you're speaking into the void and you're hoping that somebody at the other end of it will understand it and then be able to translate it for themselves. And it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do when you're writing an email. It's a hard thing to do when you're doing a one-way communication. But as I highlighted, it's also a very hard thing to do when you've got open two-way communication. So, I think more than anything, beyond the how do we not communicate dumb ideas, like a Southwest baggage thing, and not that that's dumb, that might be great for their business, but it seems like a out of character thing. But, I think the hardest piece is just the mismatch between, are we trying to speak one to many, many to many, one to one? And I think that's probably the biggest kind of hard challenge for both internal and external communication. So, be vigilant, or be diligent about doing the best you can when you are in the role of having to do that communication, and be a little sympathetic to the people that have to do the communication, because again, they're trying the best they can. I've been in those shoes. It's, you're doing the best you can. You're trying to make sure the information's right. But getting the pairing of what you're saying to who you're saying and how you're saying it is never a simple thing. So anyways, thank you for that. I hope you all enjoy. Hopefully this weekend perspective was somewhat interesting. I know we're trying to find the right balance between stuff that is like job advice and career advice and internal experience and all that stuff, and then still having some stuff around the technologies that you all care about. Always trying to find those. So feedback is always helpful. Show at thecloudcast.net or any of the other ways that you can find us at the bottom of the show notes. For communicating with that, we'd be happy to try and do our best to answer those questions, or at least provide some sort of perspective on it. So with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.